Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amherst Williams, the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of Museums, and I want to welcome you all to an exciting program today offered in collaboration with Connecticut Humanities and Susie Wilkening of Wilkening Consulting. We're really excited to share with you, or to be the portal for sharing with you, what I hope will be some really fascinating insights gleaned through the AAM's Annual Survey of Museum-Goers specific to Connecticut. And that I think will help. I'm really looking forward to learning today with all of you about what we were able to learn through this collaboration between CTH, Wilkening Consulting, and AAM. If you have any questions as we go, you can feel free to pop those in the chat. Emily, our wonderful membership and programs manager, and I will be here to kind of keep an eye on that. And queue up questions for our presenters after they're finished. But I think that's kind of all the housekeeping we need to do before we get started. So to introduce the project and the thinking behind it, I want to hand things over to my colleague, Scott Wands, who's the Deputy Director of Grants and Programs at Connecticut Humanities. Scott?
Thank you, Amherst, and thank you to Emily, and thank you to the Connecticut League once again for hosting this program and allowing the information that we're going to be sharing with you today to reach all of you. And we know there's been a lot of interest. There were over 170 folks that have registered for today's program, and really looking forward to hear some of the stuff that we've been able to learn with our work with Susie Wilkening. So this connects to a lot of the stuff that if you have received a CT Cultural Fund Operating Support Grant over the last 2 years, and you've been filling out those surveys with us at the beginning of the year or at the end of the year, and the data stories that we have been sharing from the things we've learned from all the surveys that you've done, this is a part of that whole. We want to get good information in Connecticut to be able to share with the legislature, to be able to keep funding coming to you all and support the work that you do, so that we have a better understanding of who we are, what our visitors want from us, and we can convey that to the folks at the legislature and beyond. In this particular case, and Susie will explain more, we had the ability to support a cohort of Connecticut organizations to participate in last year's American Alliance of Museums Annual Survey of Museum-Goers, which allows us to be able to know what visitors at Connecticut institutions are saying about what they want and their values and beliefs right now, and we can compare Connecticut's data against the national data set. And we will be using this at Connecticut Humanities as we move forward in this legislative cycle and future legislative cycles to, again, continue to get the funding that we provide to you all through our competitive grant making and our operating support grant programs. And with that, I will pass it over to Susie to share more about her program and what happened here in Connecticut.
Thanks so much. And thank you, all of you, for having me here today. It's kind of a funny presentation, and I feel like I'm wearing 2 hats, because I'm wearing my hat of all the work that I do with the Connecticut Humanities Council and the work that through that with all of you and collecting your data. But I'm also wearing my Annual Survey of Museum-Goers hat, which is a project we do in collaboration with the American Alliance of Museums. So what we're going to be sharing today is a little different than our standard presentations, in that we're going to be looking over research results specifically from Connecticut museums. And we're going to be looking at that data in the context of national data as well, helping you read charts and draw conclusions, give you a lot of context to place these results. You're going to be basically geeking out with me over lots of charts, and we're going to be talking really, sometimes really granularly, sometimes really big picture about these trends that we're seeing among our audiences that are coming to museums. So what are we sharing today? So every year, we partner with the American Alliance of Museums to field the Annual Survey of Museum-Goers. In 2023, Connecticut Humanities arranged for 20 museums in Connecticut to participate in this research, and we're going to be sharing those aggregate results compared against that national sample. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here, so then we can get going with all the charts. Well, there's going to be some pretty slides at the beginning. We like pretty slides. Okay. So when we field the Annual Survey of Museum-Goers, this is from year 7. We're in the field right now with year 8. What we're thinking about with those museum visitors, people who are coming in the door to museums, is we want to understand who they are And that's going to be those attitudes, those values, motivations, but also demographic characteristics, things like that. Who are these people? Sometimes we want to get their advice. What are we doing well? What can we do better? Or we might have really specific questions that we want their advice on, and we're going to do basically what they say. Like we have questions this year from 2023 on inflation. What are they using to combat inflation? Well, we're going to take that advice and do something with it. So those are advisory questions. But another type of question that we use a lot of are what we refer to as lay of the land questions. Lay of the land questions are used to help us understand how different people respond to content that's shared in museums. It's actually very complicated topography. How are they responding to specifically issues that we as a society don't have consensus on? And what are the emotions that are behind those responses? What are those values that are behind those responses? What's driving all that? Helping you understand topography so you can understand what's going to be contentious, what's not contentious, where are those landmines, do you want to step on the landmine? Maybe you do, but you want to control the blast, or maybe you want to avoid landmines altogether. Whatever the case may be, you don't want to be surprised, right? We want to help avoid surprises of something that might be controversial, so you're ready for when there is controversy. So how do we do this? We have different kinds of questions that we ask. We ask key benchmark questions about attitudes and visitation rates. We ask demographic questions. We're going to talk about all those. And then every year, because we have changing needs as a field, we change the themes for that survey every year. So in 2023, the themes were connection to humanity, civic participation, and rebuilding museum visitation as we were still emerging from the pandemic. This year, we're in the field for 2024, and we're looking at repeat visitation, and you'll see why in a few minutes, and also looking at the role of hope and imagination in museum experiences. So we're always kind of changing those themes out, seeing what's needed by people, what's needed by museums. In 2023, when we pulled the national results, we had 210 museums participating in the annual survey. The Connecticut sample actually made it bigger, like 238 or something like that. But yeah, a lot of museums across the country, museums of all different types. And what we were asking them to do was to send communications to their email lists, their social media, whatever communication lists they have, saying, hey, can you take a few minutes? Can you take a survey? And then we collect those responses. So when we pulled down the data back in March, over 107,000 responses nationwide. And you can see what types of museums these respondents were responding to. So if a history museum sent the survey, their respondents are going to be counted in that history museum sample. Just a reminder, this is a survey of frequent museum goers. These are people who are connected enough with one or more museums that they received the invitation to take a survey, took time to do so. It is not a survey of casual, sporadic, or non-visitors to museums. But we do want to capture those sentiments as well. So we also field broader population comparison sampling at the same time, a sample of just over 2,000 US adults, demographically representative sample from across the country. There's also, it's not in the slide deck, but just in case you haven't seen it, there is a broader population Connecticut sample that's a little bit older than this, that Connecticut Humanities has also provided to the field, and that you can find those resources on the Connecticut Humanities website as well. Okay, the overall Connecticut sample was just over 5,400 respondents. That's a lot of people in Connecticut who took time to respond to a museum's survey request. Now, what we ended up having to do, though, is because some museums have really big lists and they end up with really big samples, and some museums had small lists with very small samples. We realized if we just rolled all that up together, it was gonna be a little skewed. And so we ended up averaging all of the museums' responses together to create a more representative sample of different types of museum goers across the state. So when we say we averaged it, that's what we did. We took those 20 museums and averaged their results. Okay, so this is what we're going to be seeing a lot of charts like this. And how the charts work, the red bar is all museums, all US museum goers from across the country. So that's that 107,000 people. And then that blue bar is that average of all the Connecticut museums that participated in the research. So we're going to be comparing those things. And then sometimes we're going to also bring in that broader population sample. That's going to be a dark gray bar. So you'll see that coming up a little bit later. When we look at these results, what we see is that there seems to be a skew, right? You're like, wait, there's a lot of respondents over the age of 60 responding here. Are most museum goers over the age of 60? Well, yes and no. And what I'm going to do to help contextualize this is I am going to actually open up a data story that we have shared with the public. I'm going to open it up from the website so y'all can see where to find these as well. So I'll pop this over here. If you go to wilkeningconsulting.com/data stories, or just click on data stories here, there's a ton of data stories here. This is just so you can find it. But we have a data story down here called frequency and incidence gaps, and that's what we want to look at. So looking back here at Connecticut museums, we see 55% of respondents are over the age of 60. And now I'm going to blow your minds, because I'm going to actually say that museums underserve adults over the age of 60. What's going on is that we have differences between frequent museum goers and more casual and sporadic museum goers that really need to be picked apart. When it comes to frequent museum goers, those people who are really close to museums, who are visiting museums frequently, those respondents skew over the age of 60, because adults who go to museums who are over the age of 60 are more likely to be retired, so they have more time. And often they have more financial resources to go to museums. And museums do an amazing job of circulating them through these different museum experiences. So as older adults over the age of 60 who are visiting museums frequently, or visiting art museums, history museums, botanic gardens in particular, they also show up at other types of museums, but those are the big three: art, history of all types, and gardens. When we step back though, and this is where we go back to that broader population sample. There it is. And we're looking at US adults from across the country. Overall, nationally, 28% of US adults across the country say they have been to a museum in the past year. And in this sample, this is overwhelmingly what we call the casual and sporadic museum goers. They visit a couple museums a year. They're not on any communications list. Maybe they visit museums every couple of years, but they're here in the sample that, yes, they had visited a museum in the past year. So if you just kind of have in your head, a quarter of adults have been to a museum in the past year, you're pretty close. Okay, of that quarter, how does it break down by age and life stage? Turns out, and this is where we're going to say the thing about people 60 and older being least likely, adults over the age of 60 nationwide are the least likely to have been to a museum in the past year. Only 1 in 5, whereas younger adults, about 1 in 3, have been to a museum in the past year. So what's going on? What's this difference? Well, the older adults who visit museums frequently are outliers in their peer group. Most older adults don't visit museums at all. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is older adults overall have lower levels of educational attainment, and that's a predictor of museum visitation. And also, older adults were less likely to have grown up going to museums as children, so they didn't have as much of that pattern throughout their lifetime. So those are a couple things. But what's going on with the young adults? Why are they much more likely to actually have been to a museum in the past year? With those younger adults, there's a lot going on in their lives. Now, first of all, they grew up going to museums, so kind of in that pattern. But they are setting out into starting their own household, starting their careers, investing a lot of time and energy in getting that career started, getting that new social network started, doing the adulting thing. I mean, all those things, right? That takes up a lot of time and energy, and it's the time period in their life where they have the fewest financial resources. So they may be more likely to have actually been in a museum, but they're far less likely to be a member. They're far less likely to be doing that repeat visitation. So they're less likely to be on those communications lists. And so therefore, we don't see them in the museum goer survey as much until they become parents. That's when things change. But they are actually, that pipeline of future museum goers is there. And we're not worried about it. I don't lose any sleep about the future pipeline of museum goers to history museums or art museums or gardens or anything like that. They're there. It's just they're going through those different life stages. Then what's going on with parents? Parents with minor children, especially parents with children who are 10 and younger, are the most likely segment of the population to have been to a museum in the past year. And we're going to talk about parents in a couple minutes. Okay. Gender of the respondent, what we overwhelmingly see is that if there is a chief operating officer in a household, that position is almost always held by a woman. And so when you have that museum membership, when you have that communication sign up, it's most often a woman who signs up with their communications information, their email, whatever it is. And then who gets the response? I mean, the survey request, more likely to be a woman than a man. So we see this all the time, that about 2/3 of respondents nationwide are women. You can consider that the representative of the household, whatever that household composition may be, and that men are far less likely to be responding as well. Now, there are certain museums that we do see samples that skew majority men. They tend to be military museums, maritime museums, and sports-related museums. And that's where that specific interest of a man is really driving that engagement with that museum and overwhelming that list in that way. And here's where we get to parental status. Now, what's interesting about Connecticut is that y'all skew a little bit more heavily towards respondents who are parents or guardians of minor children who are 17 or younger. It looks like about 26% of your respondents fell in that category. Now, nationwide, about 30% of US households have a minor child. You're within a few percentage points of that. So you're getting fairly representative of households, with that binary yes, no, do they have a minor child in that household? So that's great. We want to see that. And that could be that summer program that y'all have really increasing a little bit of engagement with those families. That could be a driver of that. We don't know for sure, but it certainly could be. And then we can see these other categories as well, which their responses tend to stay about the same. What we really are looking at, that differences between parents who have very different needs than adults who are coming to museums with minor children. When we look at the ages of children in those households, so everybody who said they were a parent or guardian of minor children, we said, okay, what are the general ages of your children? What we do tend to see are some different patterns of museum visitation based on ages of children. So here, what we did is just to kind of give you some context, we took the US population of children and divided it out so you can get a rough approximation of what percentage of children fall in each age band. And we do it by this, are they not yet in school? Are they in elementary school, middle school, high school age? Those are the age bands we tend to think of in museums, and it's just easy for the respondent too. So Connecticut museums are doing pretty well. Look, you're outperforming US children on every single one of those things, but you're also outperforming a little bit here with high school age children. That tells us that your respondents are a little bit more likely to have older children. What we do tend to see is that certain museums are viewed as age appropriate at different ages than other museums. So children's museums, if we have a children's museum in the sample, we do, we do tend to see a big spike with 5 or younger with that age band. Zoos often do really well with families that are 5 and younger. Elementary age, that's when things start kind of changing. We do tend to see pretty high visitation at museums with families with children who are in the early elementary ages. And then some shifts start taking place around 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And then we tend to see lower visitation overall with middle and high school ages, except that y'all are not really, you're doing a little bit better with that high school. High school and middle school age families, they're more likely to go to history and art museums, but there's a big but. When we look big picture at all of these families who go to museums, what we end up seeing is that there's a big bubble, we call it the parent bubble, of families who they may be before kids, kind of casual visitation, right? There's young adults casually visiting museums. They have a kid and they're like, oh, I have a kid now. I want to be a good parent. What do good parents do? Good parents go to museums and they take their kids to museums a lot. So suddenly they go from this kind of casual visitation to incredibly frequent visitation at museums, children's museums, zoos. There's another type with a really young one. But yeah, they're going to those museums really frequently. The kids get a little older. You're getting to like first grade, transitioning to science centers in particular. But not going to history or art museums very much. There are some parents and guardians who totally take their kids to art and history museums. People who work in museums are disproportionately that type of parent. I mean, I totally took my kids when they were very young to art and history museums. But most parents look and they'll say things like, oh, we're totally going to take our kids to history museums when they're older. Or we'll take them to the art museum when they're older and we know they're not going to break the art. But man, my kids won't grasp history now, so we're going to wait. Okay, so what happens then? Because when we look at art and history museums in particular, we see very few parents and guardians responding. And the ones who are responding tend to have those older kids. What's happening that parents and guardians aren't actually making as much of that transition into art and history museums that the data suggests should be there from children's museums and zoos? Well, there's this thing called puberty, and it changes the family dynamic incredibly. So as the kids are going through age 9, 10, and 11, they start making some transitions. They want to spend more time with their friends and their family. School is getting more intense, especially that transition into middle school. Things change a lot. Their parents and guardians have become horrifyingly embarrassing to be seen with in public. So all of those things are happening at once. So families are getting really busy with all those activities. They have homework. They want to spend time with their friends. Their parents are embarrassing. They have a weekend. There's a Saturday. Nothing is on the schedule. And that parent or guardian says, hey, we have nothing going on Saturday. Let's go to the history museum. Mom, I don't want to. I want to go hang out with my friends, but whatever it is. And that parent or guardian may not have been that invested in visiting museums in the first place for themselves. They've been doing this for their kids for years. And they're like, okay, I'm not going to fight this battle. Okay, we'll go another time. And then that other time just never comes up. And so that's where we end up not seeing those families transitioning into history and art museums at the rate that we would like to see. And instead they drop back into more casual visitation. Now the visitation does kind of come back when those kids get older, when the house is empty, those adults do come back. But we don't really get those teenagers, right? And that's one of those challenges that we've been facing as a field for decades. Okay, that was a lot. So before I go on to the next few slides of demographics, is there anything in the chat that I should be knowing about?
Yeah, Susie, there's one question from MHS. Curious if you factored in whether or not the museum identified as a children's museum, and if the information that we're seeing in this chart, I think in particular, holds across all types of museums.
Right.
I know you've been talking about some of those gradients as it is, and you mentioned earlier a little bit about the averaging that you did. But I think that this question in the chat is trying to get at, like, how do the children's museums potentially skew or not skew this data that you're presenting to us here?
And
that's
that's
kind of
why
how I'm reading it.
Yeah, that's why we averaged the data so that the children's museums wouldn't skew it one way or the other. I mean, just sort of be more representative. So what I pulled up here, this is you can see it's a similar slide deck. This is from the 2023 annual survey. This is all the national results, and it also pulls out results by museum type from across the country. And so you can see immediately is that, children's museums, which over 80% of their respondents are parents or guardians of minor children, which you would expect that skew. You see it's far less. We pulled out just 4 types here for science centers, but then science centers are outperforming with families, which we kind of expected them to do. And then art museums are the ones who have the lowest percentage of respondents nationwide that are parents and guardians. It's only 12% of art museum respondents are parents and guardians. Now, keep in mind, 30% of households across the country have children. So that's a really underperformance there. And so when we look at it by age, that's how it ends up playing out by age, where we see strong performance for science centers with younger children in particular, and then it drops off to more normal ranges. Underperformance with younger children for art and history museums, increasing for middle and high school age a little bit. But there's that huge spike for children's museums with that 5 and younger band. So here you can really kind of almost see that bubble taking place right in here and then disappearing as they fall into that more casual visitation.
Thanks. That was the only question that I saw in the chat so far.
Okay, we'll keep moving. The rest of the slides go a little faster. We tend to spend a lot of time talking about this dynamic, but there is one slide where we'll go into a lot more detail. Educational attainment, we always talk about this. People who visit museums tend to be very well educated, and that falls out in the data as exactly as you see here. Over half of respondents in Connecticut have a graduate degree. Another 28% have a bachelor's degree. So that's well over 80% of respondents with a college degree versus 32% of US adults over the age of 25 have a college degree. So there is a very heavy skew there. Now, is this true for more casual and sporadic museum goers? And the answer is yes, but not so much. It's not quite as skewed as we see it there. Let me go back to this. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. So looking at the national data, 28% of US adults across the country said they've been to a museum in the past year. As you can see, people with a college degree are more likely to say yes, they've been to a museum in the past year, 36%. People with some post-secondary education, they're right there at that average, 28%. And those with a high school diploma or less, 22% say they've been to a museum in the past year. There's still a skew there when it comes to that casual and sporadic museum going, but it's not as extreme a skew as we see among those most frequent museum goers. So frequent museum goers, super well educated, casual and sporadic, more educated than the general population, but not as much. And then those non-visitors are less likely to have the higher education. Museum employment, what we're basically looking for here is like, who's responding that has a higher, stronger connection with museums, that they've volunteered, they've worked at a museum, they've worked at a museum in the past, they work now, they're on the board. We're looking at this data a little bit more carefully this spring. This is something we put a little bit on the back burner, but we do want to look at more carefully, what's the composition of volunteers, what's the composition of trustees, so we can get a better sense of those aspects of that museum engagement as well. So that's kind of something to stay tuned for, since we haven't looked at this as much yet in the analysis. We're still wrapping up 2023 analysis. Okay, race and ethnicity. This is a slide that tends to cause a lot of discussion, sometimes angst. So we're going to kind of talk through this one a little bit. This is kind of similar to the age one in some ways, in that frequent museum goer has a race and ethnicity profile that's a little bit different than what we see among more casual museum goers. So when it comes to this frequent museum goer, there's people who are closest to us and are on our communications list. What we do see is a heavy skew towards respondents saying that they or a member of their household identify as white. Just over 80%, you're about 85% in Connecticut. So that's totally within the norms of what we tend to see year over year over year. And overall, looking at those red and blue bars, relatively few people of color responding to museums surveys. However, what we did on this chart is something a little bit different. We took that broader population sample. We took that 28% of the broader population that said that, yes, they had been to a museum in the past year, and we plotted out their race and ethnicity. And if you look at those gray bars, it's actually fairly closely representative of US adults across the country. About 2/3 of US adults identify as white non-Hispanic, and that's about what we see here as well. And these other percentages are pretty close to what we see in the US population. It's not that museums don't engage and attract people of color, but they're much more likely to be casual or sporadic museum goers. So let's look at on that data story, so you can see what we mean by that. Now, keeping in mind, 28% of US adults said they had been to a museum in the past year. It's actually 1 percentage point lower for people who identify as white, not Hispanic or Latino. So there we actually say white people are a little bit less likely to be engaged by museums than other people of color. And Asian or Asian American audiences, or the population, is actually the most likely to say they've been to a museum in the past year. So that casual and sporadic museum going is where we do tend to see people of color coming into museums. They're not in that frequent museum goer sample, but they are visiting museums at that casual level. Now, what's going on with the white population? Because there's something interesting here to also keep in mind. One of the things, we do see they tend to heavily skew in that frequent category. So we do see some of that 27% is going to fall in there. But they're also less likely to visit museums. So what's going on within that white population is that we have something going on at the other end of the visitation spectrum. When we look at the people who say, I never, ever go to museums from the broader population, like, I don't like museums. I don't go to museums, never. That segment of respondents also skews disproportionately white. And so we have white people who are more likely to be at the extremes. Either they're that super frequent museum goer or they're not visiting at all, with people of color in the middle. Now, the white respondent who says they never visit museums at all, there are a couple of characteristics that they tend to have in common. They are more likely to be over the age of 60. And they are also more likely to identify as conservative, especially very conservative. And that's going to come up on the politics side in a bit. We asked respondents if they consider themselves a member of the LGBTQ+ community. Overall, a little bit less than 10% of frequent museum goers identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. It's a little bit higher in the broader population, largely because the frequent museum goer sample skews older, right? And older people in the broader population are a little bit less likely to volunteer on a survey if they are a member of the LGBTQ+ community, whereas younger adults are much more likely to do so. So that's part of what's skewing and making that happen. One of the things we're also tracking, though, within this question is whether people identify as an ally of the LGBTQ+ community. And one of the things that we're seeing here year over year is that there has been a slight increase in people identifying as an ally, showing that support to the LGBTQ+ community. So we're going to continue to track that over time. But museum goers, frequent museum goers, are much more likely to identify as an ally of the LGBTQ+ community than the broader population, where fewer than 10% do. You can see that low bar right here. Okay, and then the final demographic question is around political values. We consider this part of the demographic questions as part of who this person is. And what we see here is really interesting, and we've seen this for a number of years. When we look at this slide, and we're stepping back and going, what's going on here? What we see is that big picture. If you add up these red bars, and the same thing's true in Connecticut, if you add up the blue bars, over half of frequent museum goers identify as liberal. And only about 12, 13, 14% identify as conservative. That in no way, shape, or form represents our population of adults in this country. It doesn't even represent it here. I'm in Seattle. I mean, I'm in a really blue bubble. It doesn't even represent Seattle. So there is a really heavy skew here that we need to be very much aware of and very thoughtful about. So one of the things we did on this slide, once again, is we took that broader population sample and we took those people who said, yes, they had been to a museum in the past year. And we said, okay, let's plot out their political values. And what you see there is actually really different. There, they actually skew, we see these spikes here, more conservative. So it's not that conservatives are not visiting museums, but they are visiting museums less frequently than liberals. Liberals are much more likely to be that frequent museum goer, conservatives that more casual and sporadic museum goer. Now, one thing I want y'all to be aware of, because you're practitioners in the field, people who work in museums, and this includes volunteers, this includes trustees, but especially staff, also have this more liberal skew that we see among frequent museum goers. 70% of US museum professionals across the country identify as liberal, and only 7% identify as conservative. This is something to be very thoughtful and aware about, because that means the majority of content that's being produced in museums is being produced with a liberal bias. That's not necessarily bad, but we want you to be thoughtful about it and be aware, is that bias mean that you are standing up for the truth? Because in some ways, a liberal bias does mean truth about our past, truth about science. Or is that bias that is inherently in a lot of that content, is it is it not based in truth? Is it based in people's values? Be aware of that. Be thoughtful about that. Stop, take a moment and check your work and go, is this my bias speaking out? And if you're conservative and doing this work, the same thing still holds true. Is this your bias speaking out when you're looking at this content that you're sharing? Have somebody you can use it as a sounding board who has a different political value set. And then think through what is going to be the most effective way you can share this content, and how is that bias going to be affecting that effectiveness. The bottom line is here, be thoughtful about it. We are seeing some disturbing trends that conservatives are pulling back from museums. They're visiting less frequently over time. So if we look at our historical data, we are seeing a little bit less visitation, less frequent visitation from conservatives. And we are seeing, and written in comments, a calling out of museums and their liberal bias, saying, I used to visit more frequently, and now I'm visiting less because of the liberal bias of museums. That deprives us of an opportunity to reach that audience. So again, it's that being thoughtful about it and being very much aware about it, and then making that right decision for your institution. Now that's some hard stuff, right? Are there any questions here on the politics? You're going to hear a little bit of politics as we keep going, but this was like the main dive on it.
We just wanted to verify, Susie, because there was a question, Clarissa and I were going back and forth in the chat, that all of that broader data about casual and sporadic visitors, that's national level data,
That's
right?
national, yes.
Okay, great. Sharon Historical Society wonders, how do you balance quote unquote liberal bias with DEAI work that is often seen as primarily liberal?
And this is where things get really hard, because there are many topics now that are perceived to be liberal that go to the heart and soul of what museums are often doing. Science is one. Science centers have been grappling with this for quite some time, that the evidence of science, think about evolution, you can think now about public health, climate change. The evidence of science is overwhelmingly one way. Liberals tend to go along with the evidence of science, and conservatives are more likely to be saying, no, climate change isn't happening, whatever it is. That's where we see a very heavy bias that sticking to the science is going to be perceived politically as being liberal. That's been going on for quite some time. Now we're seeing that escalate in more emotional ways, especially with history, art too, but especially with history, around inclusive history, around DEAI work, because now, we're saying this is the entire evidence of the past. This part of the past was ignored for a long time, deliberately, not deliberately, for whatever reason. It was ignored though. And now we're bringing in that story to have a more complete telling of the past. We're saying as historians, this is the history. This is the evidence. And then we're having this resistance to that as this is revisionist history. You're changing history, all these different kind of pushback, right? And that's where we have this conflict coming in once again. And it's even more emotional than that science conflict, because this is about people's identity. And so they use really emotional language in this pushback, and it can be very visceral. It can also be very, we see a lot of hate speech and written comments from people who are who we would characterize as anti-inclusive, who are using political hate speech to characterize their resistance to a more inclusive, the inclusive work of not only historians, but also of museums. So this is one of those things that, while museums are nonpartisan institutions, your 501c3 organizations, you're not political entities. We are existing in a very politicized environment, and your work is being perceived politically, whether you like it or not. And that word politics is going to come out really quickly. And that defensiveness is going to come out really quickly about that work because it's just so wrapped into people's identities and their values and and their expectations of when they're thinking about the past, or what they're thinking about what is art, or whether they're thinking about what they're thinking about in terms of science and all these different things. So it's really hard. And that's why, thinking about and being thoughtful about what you're presenting is going to, and having that check is going to be really helpful to give you that first step. But we also have some tools for you. And so I'm going to actually switch back to this data stories page. If you scroll right now, this is all reverse chronological order. We're about to launch a new website that'll be searchable. But until then, if you scroll down, way down here, about halfway, this is a free download from AAM's website. It's a primer we wrote about audiences and inclusion and bringing inclusive content to museums. And it's helping you think through how do you present that content in ways that it's going to be more engaging to a wider variety of values and attitudes. So there's that free download. You just click on that and it'll take you to the free download link from AAM. Here's a shortcut 10-step guide. So that's one piece. If you go back up to the top for 2022, in particular, beware the false consensus effect. It also gives you some information about how you prepare for conflict, especially on those topics that might be more fraught that you might be tackling. And so that one's a great one right here. And also for your own self-care, amplification versus over-amplification is one. If you click on that, you'll see a PDF will download. But thinking through, what happens when you get that critical comment? You get that very, very strongly opinioned person who's standing in front of you and saying something that could be really hateful. How do you take that deep breath? How do you contextualize it? What do you amplify? What do you make sure you not over-amplify? And thinking through those steps. So those are some things that really immediately you can download those right when this is over and have access to those. And then if you have follow-up questions, you can by all means reach out to me or to Jessica, who's also on this call with Wilkening Consulting, and we can give you some advice too.
Great, thanks, Susie. I want to get back to a question that Michelle's been waiting patiently about. Okay. That's actually a really great question about the survey in general. Sure. So for the purposes of the survey, is it clear if the survey respondent considers the visit that they're responding about to be a general one to an exhibition or institution versus visiting for a specific program? So for the most part, museums are not doing what we call intercept surveys, where somebody's interrupted during their visit and say, hey, can you take a few minutes and take a survey? So we're not asking about a specific visit. What we're asking about is in general, you're on this communications list for this museum. What are your general thoughts about the museum? And then what are your general thoughts about museum content at any type of museum? So we're asking a little bit more big picture. What we do tend to find is that when you do intercept surveys, that's a great question to ask. And that is something that's a different kind of research that kind of works well with, so if you have both pieces, you can kind of go, oh, this is what people at the floor of the museum are saying. This is what people are saying more big picture. And so it can give you a more complete view of what's going on in your museum. Okay. We have about 14 minutes left. So what I would like to do is I want to talk about visitation trends really quickly, because I know some of you are still not back to where you were pre-pandemic, because we have your numbers, so we know. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about civics, because we're coming up to that 250th. I know a lot of you are history organizations and you care about that. And we want to talk about civics and the polarization of civics. So I want to make sure that gets squeezed in. So going back to our data stories page, this one is down here called just simply museum visitation. And what we're looking at here is national data, again, looking at those visitation patterns about why and who and what is going on in terms of museum visitation post-pandemic. So we were in the field last year,
last spring. And at that point, when we released this data story, which was actually in September, it had been 3.5 years since the pandemic had started. And of course, the pandemic devastated your attendance for the most part. And we had gone into the field with to do what we call a snapshot survey of United States museums. And it indicated that back in last spring, about 2/3 of museums had not returned to their pre-pandemic norms, and that the average attendance that museums were experiencing was about 71% of their pre-pandemic norms. Now, Connecticut actually has done a little bit better. We do have some Connecticut data because y'all provide us such granular data. We know Connecticut museums have done a little bit better. We think that's in large part to the funding that y'all received, that summer program for families, things like that. But this is the national big picture. So if you're still not back to pre-pandemic norms, you've got a lot of company. The good news is that when it comes to what that incidence, when we look at the national data, has somebody visited a museum in the past year? In 2023, we saw 28% of US adults have been to a museum in the past year, and that's right in the pre-pandemic norms. Pre-pandemic, we typically saw 25 to 31% range. We're right there. So it's not that people are not returning to museums. There are a few people who still haven't returned, but for the most part, people have returned to museums. It doesn't seem to be the issue with attendance. Instead, what's going on is that it's an issue of repeat visitation. They're not visiting museums as frequently. And that is true of not visiting a specific museum repeatedly, so that if they're a member of your museum, maybe they're not visiting your museum as much as they were pre-pandemic, or as many different museums. So how do we know this? So in the 2023 data, we ask this question, every year we ask this question from pre-pandemic times. We basically say, how often do you visit this museum? So, somebody's taking this survey, it's from the Wadsworth Athenaeum. How often do you visit the Wadsworth Athenaeum? So we ask that kind of question every single year, and we're rolling up all the results here nationally. And so the pre-pandemic norm was our 2020 data. We were in the field in the winter of 2020. So that's as pre-pandemic as you can get. And about a third of respondents were saying they were visiting 4 or more times a year. And only 20% said it's been more than a year, less than once a year. And then you can see this brown bar for 2021, that extreme drop, and that's the pandemic hitting. And you see the spike over here, less than once a year, where it goes back up. It's been more than a year since I've been there. So we can clearly see the pandemic hitting, and then you see returning rates. And in 2023, it's just not there yet. We have a deficit of about 10 percentage points of this 4+ range. And that's really where we're seeing that weakness, is people just not visiting as frequently as they were in the past. Similarly, we ask how many different museums they visit to get breadth of museum going, and we're seeing a similar pattern. Pre-pandemic, if you add these together, 70% of respondents were saying they were visiting 3 or more different museums. And in 2023, it was 62%. That's a gap of 8 percentage points. That adds up to a lot of visits. So what we're experiencing is an ongoing, persistent problem of getting that repeat visitation back to where it was. And so since that seems to be the issue, that is one of the main themes of this year's annual survey, is looking at that repeat visitation, seeing what's the hang up there in terms of that frequency, and how can we get that frequency back up to where it was pre-pandemic. So open questions here. We're going to have more information in a few months. And so stay tuned on that and see what's happening in 2024 and what we're learning about that repeat visitation. And with that,
yeah, I just wanted to, if you have a sec, I just want to go back to Michelle's question about program visitation versus general visitation. I think, she's trying to get at, she's coming from an institution where their visitation for specific programs is much higher than just sort of general visitation coming to see the museum. And is kind of curious if there's more research on this, either in the work that you've done, or if you could point to other resources around, and, and I guess some of the question is like, how much of is that a distinction that museums see that visitors don't see? Or, how could she do more work to dig into that? What would you recommend?
So the battery of questions that we ask doesn't really give us a lot of insight in that, because we're asking, what we do ask, what do you do well, good exhibits, good programs, but people don't tend to distinguish that in their answer, as in they're going to answer for all of those things. I think where we're going to have a lot more detail is when we have the results from this year's annual survey, because we do ask, the questions that we're asking in 2024 do go into, they need more programs, they need to update their exhibits, getting much more specific about what is it that brings people back for a repeat visit, what is it that sparks that visit so that they are coming more frequently. And that's pulling apart, is it the exhibits, is it the programs, or is it other things as well? Is it that they're getting out-of-town guests coming back, and so now they're coming back more frequently to show off their local museum? That's where we're asking those questions this year. So I don't have immediate go-to national resource for those kinds of questions as well. I think it says I wait and see is the best I've got right now.
Great, thank you. I appreciate you digging into that a little bit.
Sure.
Do you have more to present?
Yeah,
I'll fade into the background and let you finish. We have a few questions.
I wanted to talk about civics just for a few minutes. And I'm going down to that question. So, civic participation was one of the themes for this year's survey. And when you think about the word civics and you think about civil society, things like that, those words, those definitions of those words are pretty nonpartisan, right? It's about what are our rights and responsibilities as citizens or residents of a place, and how is it that our societies, our communities actually work, right? The results came back rather interestingly. And so when we were asking these questions about civics and civil society and civic participation, we were trying very much to ground it into this kind of neutral political space of being connected to a community, things like that. And so we started off this battery of questions with asking about the impact of museums. Because what we were trying to get at is there are some things that people immediately say has been, the impact of museums in their life, more knowledge, more curiosity. Those just come right off the tongue for lots of people when they're looking at these kinds of questions and asking and choosing responses. But we were starting with this question to test whether they were making a connection between museums and our civil society, museums and community, museums and that civic space as well. And what we found overall is that not that many people, if you look at these pretty low responses, are thinking about museums and civics and civil society and connecting them too much. So first we have that kind of low response, right? So then we backed it up and said, okay, we are in your community, we're an organization in your community. So first, let's just talk about what does it mean to be a good member of society? And let's not even think about museums. What does it mean? What are the things people should do to be a good member of society? And you can see, if you look at this response, voting is seen pretty universally as something that's important for people to do. You see a cluster of things here that are also pretty well responded to. Inclusive is one, being inclusive in your community. Conservation of natural resources is seeing that as a civil society good. Community activities, listening, respecting other viewpoints, and also learning about our shared history. And then you see much lower responses on patriotism. That skews heavily conservative when we look at the political results. And then advocacy and participation in protests. That skewed heavily liberal in our results. So people who are liberal are much more likely to say those things than conservatives. But these responses that were really high are also masking something. We have to remember our response base skewed pretty heavily liberal. And what we did find is about 40% of conservatives were having some different viewpoints that didn't really come out in this question, but came out in the next two questions. Also, if you look at the broader population, it's really typical for broader population samples to be lower, where they just tend to mark fewer choices. But you do see that most of the responses here are in that 40%, 40 to 50% range, a little bit lower for advocacy and participation in protests, same general political patterns. So then we brought museums into it. What role should museums play in building a civil society you want to be a part of? And if you look at those answer choices, these are randomized in the survey, so they came up in any order, but as cohesive democracy, finding common ground, conservation once again, civility and understanding, correcting inaccurate perceptions of others, humanizing those we disagree with, developing civic action skills. We looked at this, and this could be our liberal bias coming out, as these were all, we were very careful to word these in ways that were pretty much what we felt was the nonpartisan description. The full survey text of the answer choices is at the end of the slide there. Yet we found that nearly 1 in 5, a little bit higher here in Connecticut, said these are not things that museums should be doing. It's just like a hard no. And when we looked at those respondents and their open-ended comments, what we found very quickly was that, first of all, those respondents, it's not all conservatives. I want to be very clear about that. It's about 40% of conservatives fell in this group, hardly any liberals. So there was a definite political skewing here. But most conservatives found answer choices they liked and moved on. But that 40% was a very much a segment that is taking the words civics and civil society and civil discourse and all those things, and now talking about them in very polarizing ways. They're using words politics, they're using liberal as a pejorative to describe those values of civics and civil society as being liberal values and therefore political and therefore not appropriate in museum settings. Now, this is not a museum-specific problem. It's something we're experiencing, but this is something that's affecting lots of nonprofits on many issues in the communities, that this kind of work is now being viewed through this polarizing lens by people who are more likely to be in that very conservative segment of the population. So that politicizing of civics is something to be very much aware of, especially as we go into the 250th, which is really about the founding of this country, which is a civic thing, and about what our civil society looks like and the values we'll hold dear as a country. And then the last museums and civic participation question basically says whether you think museums should or should not be places of civic participation. Again, not saying what that civic participation is. Again, we get about 20% saying no, stay out of this entirely. But we get most people saying that yes, museums can be places of nonpartisan civic participation, be places where you can enroll people to vote, do all those kinds of things. And do these non-political activities. So what we really want to highlight here is that challenge where there's a segment of the population that's politicizing what should be a nonpartisan universal value, and just to be very aware of that when you talk about your role in the community, when you talk about the founding of the country, you're talking about the civics that we're experiencing and the civil discourse we're experiencing today, to just be thoughtful about that and aware of it. So if controversy does arise, you're ready for it. Okay, are there any thoughts or questions there on civics?
Yeah, we had another question from Sharon Historical as to whether there was anything open-ended here. Like, did anyone write in, elaborate on what they saw the role of museums as being, sort of beyond the particular constraints of the survey questions itself? Was there anything more open-ended?
Yes, so there were open-ended questions. People who who basically chose the negative answers, that museums should not be doing these things. They got a very specific open-ended question. It kind of said, why not? And if not museums, who? Do you want this work to be done, but by somebody else? And so, a small percentage of people got those questions. I would say about 20% of respondents. First of all, the vast majority of them did not say whether they want this work to be done by anyone. They ignored that part of the question. But their what tended to happen in written comments were two related things. One was immediately saying this is political and museums should be neutral. And so that iteration over and over and over again, and that use of that kind of language. The second thing they tended to say were that museums are places of facts and that they could make up their own mind. And we see that phrase a lot in written comments from much more likely from conservatives and liberals. It's not that liberals never say it, but they hardly ever write that phrase out. Just give me the facts, I'll make up my own mind. And that is a phrase that is used to put kind of almost like a barrier between them and the content in a way that says, you can only do this one thing. You can only present facts, and I'm going to decide what those facts are. And what we do tend to find, I'm going to be really candid the way I word this, is that it is used to dismiss evidence, whether it's science, whether it's evidence of the past, to dismiss things that they disagree with as opinion and not facts, so that they then therefore are not bringing it into their what they consider to be appropriate for a museum. So it's a way of shutting down inclusive content a lot. That's in somebody's opinion. That's not the evidence. And it's also used to shut down or to attempt to shut down science content as well if they disagree with it.
Thanks, Susie. We had a question about, and I think this is a great question if you're able to share the answer, which museums in Connecticut participated?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the list immediately at my fingertips.
Can you gesture a little bit about what the contours of that group
I can
look
share
like?
the list if you would like. The list of participating institutions, we tried to have a breadth and depth of types of museums in general in society. So we had history museums, art museums, children's museums, all the different types, or as representative as we could get. So Bartlett Arboretum and Gardens, Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, Connecticut Landmarks, Connecticut Science Center, Connecticut's Beardsley Zoo, the Eli Whitney Museum, Florence Griswold Museum, Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, Kids Play Children's Museum, Litchfield Historical Society, Lyman Allen Art Museum, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, Mattatuck Museum, Mystic Aquarium, Mystic Seaport Museum, New Britain Museum of American Art, Stanford Museum and Nature Center, Stepping Stones Museum for Children, the New England Carousel Museum, and the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. We put a lot of work in with Susie to try to get type and geography spread. We actually had, and I won't name them, a few smaller institutions we were hoping to participate. We couldn't get a statistically stable sample size from some places that were a little bit too small. So we had to change that up a little bit. But our intent was to try to represent the breadth and depth of what museums are in Connecticut with the participating group of institutions.
Thanks, Scott, for that elaboration. I don't know if there's anything you want to share, Susie, beyond that.
No, I mean, it ended up being pretty close to what we saw nationally in the terms of the museums that enrolled nationally, and fed into what the bigger themes that we were seeing from these different kinds of museum types nationally. There's other parts of the annual survey, because I know we've hit our hour, that we're not sharing today, but I want to make sure that y'all know how to access the bigger picture national results as you're moving forward in your own institution. So go back to just go back and share my screen again, because I know I stopped. There we are. So we tend to release our results on our website on this data stories page, and so you can see the most recent data stories are coming from 2023. They're at the top of the page. But there are a ton, I think there's like 70 data stories if you go all the way down, going back several years, any topic that you might be grappling with, you can come and take a look and see if you can find something similar. It will be searchable in a couple weeks, but right now you kind of have to dig through. But that's the quickest and fastest way of seeing where our research is being released and the national results. It's all very graphic. It's all infographic, so you'll have a good time looking at those graphics. And then you can always reach out to us. You can get added to our email list, things like that. And we can also make sure that you're getting those research releases as they're coming out nationally.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think the thing that I'm left with is wondering, and I wonder if you can speak to this. Most of I know Scott talked a little bit about the data challenges and the sample size challenges of getting this information from smaller institutions. Do you have a sense, given your vast experience working, on this kind of, statistical gathering and analysis, whether the insights that we see at mid-size and larger institutions apply to smaller museums as well?
Yeah, and I spent so much time on the demographics because those demographic patterns very much apply to smaller institutions, because visitors to small museums are also going to big museums, are also going to medium-sized museums. That's very much focused on the visitor. Where we do see differences is maybe in attendance patterns. Some of the larger museums are getting back to the normal attendance, pre-pandemic norms much more quickly than smaller museums. Botanic gardens, they never really had as much of a drop in the first place versus historic house museums, which probably had the biggest drop in attendance. So yeah, we do see some differences there, more about museum type than size. But very much the questions that we're asking that we shared with you today, what we're looking at is their values and how it affects any kind of museum visit. Where we do see differences by size is more on, and we didn't share these questions with you in this presentation, but where we're looking at the benchmark questions like, was a museum doing well? How are they falling short? What can they do better? Why are people visiting this institution? And we do see some differences. Hyper-local museums are different than what we would consider a destination museum. And so that's going to play out a little bit differently depending on different museum types.
Great, thanks. If people want to dig into this information a little bit more, is there a place where the results of this survey are published already, or where people can access the information that you shared today, whether that's through sharing your slide deck or through a report? How can people get a refresh and dig into this data that you've presented to us on their own?
So that page with the data stories, that's where we release the national results, and we do it in little bites. There's little infographic bites. That's the best place for the big picture nationally. This slide deck, I believe, is going to be on the Connecticut Humanities website, Scott.
Yeah, I don't have easy access to my keyboard here in the big room, but we have a data page as well, where this will go with some other information from the work we've done in Connecticut. And we'll be sharing it out in other ways as well.
And that will have the entirety of, the other questions that we didn't talk about today, such as those benchmark questions and falling short, doing well, that kind of thing. So that'll have the entire scope of the questions, and it has a complete list of the actual questions that were used in the instrument.
Great. Thank you so much.
I'm wondering if you can just talk about, like, I know your new survey for 2024 is live. Yep. Is it too late for places to participate if they wanted to participate with you? Can you give a little bit of talk about that?
So we are just now going into the field for 2024. The annual survey of museum goers is typically, people enroll this time of year. And okay, so I'm like having to think differently. So enrollment is by February 20, it's leap year, isn't it? February 29th. Enroll by February 29th and launch your survey by March 8th, and you can participate. It costs $1,250 per museum. So we try to keep it as affordable as possible, though I know that's out of reach of the really small museums. We look for samples of about 100 for stability purposes. So if you have a really small list, you may not be able to get to 100. But if you have a decent sized list of a couple thousand people on your email list, then we're probably going to be able to get you there. You field your survey by March 8th. Jessica, who's also on the call, does a fantastic job of giving you everything you need to do to launch your survey. We give you sample graphics, we give you sample text, so you can create that email and send it out. We collect the results as they come in. It's all done online. And then typically in the end of April, you get your first report, which is a spreadsheet comparing you against all of your peer groups. So you can get compared against, If you're a zoo, you're going to get compared against zoos across the country. If you are a botanical garden, you'll get compared against botanical gardens across the country, often by budget size as well. So all these different comparisons, all your written comments, and then about a month later, you get a slide deck that looks a lot like what you just saw, but for your museum with your results compared against the national results as well as against your peer group. So if you're a historic house museum, you're going to be compared against other historic house museums in that deck. So then you have these slides. And also all that comes out in the spring. And then, am I forgetting anything else, Jessica, about this? Did I get it?
Sounded good.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica. And so if you have any questions about this year's annual survey, you can reach out to Jessica or to me. The website for the annual survey, because AAM has a website just for that. And it
Jessica already popped it in the chat.
Thank you, Jessica, because I was about to do that. Where you can find more information. And then the themes this year are about repeat visitation. And we're looking at hope and imagination. We're trying to find what is that place where people of different values, especially those political values, can find some common ground that we can maybe use to build something, rebuild our society, rebuild our democracy, rebuild our communities, and maybe just smooth things out a little bit. So if that is of interest to you, hope and imagination, this is a great survey.
Great, thank you so much. I think, Emily is going to be sending a follow-up email as she usually does. And I have a whole list of things that I think we'll plan, based on what's been the conversation that we've been having just now about the resources that we can include in that message out to everybody afterwards as well. Susie, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to dive into all of these questions with us and to share the research that you have done. Thanks especially to the folks at Connecticut Humanities for funding this project and making it possible and accessible for the museums that did participate. It's great to have this kind of comparison and help us understand our audiences better, both here in Connecticut and how it compares to what's going on nationwide. And thanks especially to Emily for all the organizational work that she did to pull this program together. And Jessica, I'm sure you're doing tons of back-end stuff too. So it's great to have you with us. There are always the folks behind the scenes who are, doing a lot. Thank you to everyone who's stuck around for 15 minutes after time. We'll be sharing the recording and we look forward to seeing you at a future league program. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.